Tonight, FBI investigators at Quantico could be on the verge, perhaps, of a critical breakthrough in the Nancy Guthrie case, potentially using a new and cutting-edge technology that has proven to extract DNA from even the most difficult and degraded evidence.
4 hours of Nancy Guthrie's final night are completely gone, with no trace whatsoever. She was 84 years old, unable to walk 50 yards on her own. Yet she vanished without a trace.
Investigators have found few clues that we know of. There's the blood spatter on her doorstep, which DNA testing confirmed belonged to the 84-year-old grandmother.
The FBI launched a massive search lasting 32 days, chased down thousands of tips, and ran every single lead into the ground. Nothing fit. Nothing made sense. Then investigators pulled her final phone call, and everything in that investigation came to a violent halt.
32 days into the search for Nancy Guthrie, investigators are still poring over thousands of tips. But could the missing piece of evidence simply be the suspect's cell phone?
Because what they heard on that call didn't point toward a stranger or a break-in or any kind of accident. It pointed unmistakably at someone who had been standing right there the entire time. Someone nobody had ever once suspected.
We believe our mom is still out there. We need your help.
The last night nobody can explain. The night didn't look unusual when Nancy Guthrie stepped inside her house, but something inside it had already gone wrong, and she didn't know it yet. At 9:48 in the evening, Nancy closed the door behind her, expecting the same quiet routine she had followed for years. 2 minutes later, the garage door shut, sealing her inside. From that point on, the house became a closed space where something had already begun to move against her. Nancy placed her things down and headed toward the kitchen where her medication sat waiting. That routine kept her alive. Missing it was not an option. She reached the counter, but she never took the pills. Something pulled her attention away, something sharp enough to break a habit she never broke. It started with a strange sound. It was not loud, but it was wrong. Nancy froze and listened. Her mind stayed clear, and that was what made it worse. She knew her house. She knew every normal sound it made. This was not one of them. Nancy turned, quickly scanned the room, and called out, asking who was there. No one answered. The silence that followed felt different from the silence she was used to. Nancy reached for her phone. Her hands were not steady, but she managed to unlock it. She made a call. That call would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence. But in that moment, it was a lifeline. Nancy spoke in a controlled voice, but fear pushed through her words. She said enough to make it clear that something was wrong inside her home. Then something changed. Whoever was inside that house was no longer staying hidden. The shift was immediate and violent. The struggle that followed did not last long, but it did not need to. Nancy tried to move, tried to create distance, but her body could not respond fast enough, and the person who had come into her space knew that. The attacker had picked someone who could not escape and could not resist. Nancy's phone never left the house. Her keys stayed where she dropped them. Her medication remained untouched on the counter, only a few feet away from where everything was happening. That detail would later become one of the most disturbing facts of the case, because it showed how quickly her control over the situation had been taken from her. For the next few hours, nothing left the house. No calls followed, no messages went out. No alarms were triggered. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. Inside, everything had already gone wrong. At 1:47 in the morning, someone accessed the home security system and turned off the Google Nest doorbell camera. That action erased the house's ability to watch its own front entrance. This was not an accident. It required knowledge of how the system worked. It meant the person inside that house knew exactly what to disable and when to do it. At 2:12 in the morning, the motion sensor still picked up movement outside. Someone moved near the property, close enough to trigger the system, but there was no video recording. The service that stored the footage had not been active, so the system captured nothing that could be seen. The one moment that could have shown a face or a clear image disappeared into nothing. Inside the house, Nancy's condition was getting worse. She depended on her medication to regulate her heart. Without it, her body could not maintain stability. Every minute without those pills pushed her closer to collapse. The attacker did not need to rush. Time itself had become a weapon. Nancy was 84 years old. Her mind remained sharp, but her body could not keep up. She could not fight back. She could not break free. Whoever had done this understood exactly how vulnerable she was. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting data. The device that tracked her heart went silent. It did not send another signal. It did not record another beat. It simply stopped. That moment marked the end of every measurable sign of her life. 3 systems had recorded 3 moments. The camera was turned off. Movement was detected outside. Then the pacemaker went silent. All of it happened within a short window of time, and all of it pointed to the same conclusion. Someone, or something, had taken control of that house, and Nancy had no way out. Morning came, and the outside world moved forward as if nothing had happened. Nancy did not appear for her church live stream, which she never missed. That absence immediately raised concern. Calls were made, but there was no response. By late morning, Nancy's family arrived at the house. They entered the house and immediately began searching every room, calling Nancy's name as their voices grew more anxious with each unanswered call. Fear started to build as they moved from space to space, opening doors and checking corners that felt increasingly empty. They found Nancy's phone, keys, and medication, but there was no sign of Nancy anywhere, and there were no clear answers waiting for them, no obvious explanation that made sense. Everything Nancy needed to survive was still inside that house, but she was nowhere to be found. Around noon, emergency services were called. Investigators arrived and began pulling data from every available device. They rebuilt the night using timestamps and digital records. Each piece of information added pressure, but none of it gave them a complete picture. Then they found the phone call Nancy had made earlier that night. It did not match the simple timeline they had started with. And when investigators examined who she called and what that call contained, the entire timeline had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The phone call that changed everything. The analysts initially expected the phone records to simply confirm what everyone already believed about the case. They assumed the data would show ordinary call patterns, familiar contacts, and no information that could alter the investigation. For that reason, they reviewed Nancy's final outgoing communication from her recovered device as a routine step. It was intended only to support the established timeline. But instead of reinforcing the timeline, the result contradicted their assumptions and introduced unexpected complications into the investigation. The number Nancy called did not belong to her children. It was not Savannah, Annie, or Cameron. It was not a close friend. It was not anyone she contacted regularly. The moment that detail became clear, the room shifted. Investigators stopped treating the call as background information and started treating it as the center of the entire night. The question came immediately, and it refused to go away. Who did Nancy trust enough to call in that moment, and why that person? 4 hours of Nancy's final night are completely unaccounted for. The window runs from 9:48 in the evening, when Nancy stepped through her front door, to roughly 2 in the morning, when her pacemaker stopped transmitting entirely. The timing of the call placed it directly inside the 4-hour gap. Nancy selected that number and made that connection on purpose. That decision mattered more than anything else they had. Then investigators examined the location data attached to the call. Every phone leaves behind small digital traces that show where it was at the moment a call was made. They expected to see her inside her home, exactly where she should have been after returning from dinner. But the data did not match that expectation. The signal placed Nancy somewhere that did not fully align with the idea of her sitting quietly inside her house. It was close, but not exact. It suggested movement, or, at the very least, a position that investigators could not immediately explain. That detail alone forced them to question whether the timeline they had built was already missing something important. Then they turned to the audio. At first, Nancy's voice sounded controlled. She did not sound panicked. She did not raise her voice. Nancy spoke clearly, as if she was trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But the more they listened, the more the tension became impossible to ignore. There were pauses in her speech that did not fit a relaxed conversation. They were not natural breaks. They were interruptions, moments where something else demanded her attention. Those pauses told a story Nancy's words did not. Audio specialists enhanced the recording and pushed past her voice to isolate what sat underneath it. They slowed the call down, filtered out the background noise, and focused on every faint sound that had been buried in the original recording. What they uncovered changed everything. Behind Nancy's voice, there were footsteps. They were faint, but they were there. Then came another sound, a door closing distantly, but clear enough to identify. It was not part of the conversation. It was part of the environment around her. Nancy was not alone when she made that call. Someone else was already in that space, either in the same room or moving just outside of it. That meant the situation had already escalated before the silence began. It meant the danger was present while Nancy was still speaking. The call itself did not last long. Nancy made it once, and there was no second attempt, no follow-up, no message left behind. Investigators concluded that Nancy was trying to say something quickly, something that had to be delivered before she lost the chance to say it at all. Then the line ended, and the silence took over. The gap between that call and the sequence of events that followed was so narrow that investigators could not separate them. Within that same stretch of time, the doorbell camera was turned off at 1:47 in the morning. Motion was detected outside at 2:12. Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting at 2:28. 3 separate systems recorded 3 separate events, all pointing to a controlled and deliberate progression. And yet, none of those events felt like they belonged to the same moment as that call. This was where the timeline broke. In most investigations, a final call simplifies everything. It narrows the field. It connects the victim to a known person. It provides direction. But in this case, it did the opposite. The call carried the signature of familiarity. Nancy chose that number herself. She spoke without panic. She stayed composed. Everything that followed carried a completely different signature. Turning off the camera required knowledge of the security system. It suggested planning and technical awareness. The motion detected outside pointed to physical presence and movement around the property. The pacemaker going silent pointed to a critical event happening inside her body. Those actions felt calculated and controlled. They felt like the work of someone who had prepared for this. But the call did not feel that way. If the night began with someone Nancy knew, someone she trusted enough to call without hesitation, then why did everything after that look like the actions of a different person entirely? If an unknown intruder was responsible for what came later, then why did Nancy's voice show no clear sign of fear during that call? The two halves did not fit together. The call refused to answer the questions investigators needed answered. Instead, it created more of them. It split the night into 2 distinct parts that could not be easily connected. The first part showed a voluntary act, a familiar contact, and a controlled voice. The second part showed interference, movement, and a life support system going completely dark. There was no clear bridge between those 2 realities. And that was the moment the investigation changed completely. What had seemed like a straightforward case of a vulnerable woman being taken from her home became something far more complicated and difficult to untangle. Because the last thing Nancy chose to do was reach out to someone. And the unanswered question that still remains is who was on the other end of that call, and what did they know that no one else did? It was at this point of the unfolding mystery that law enforcement entered Nancy's home. What they found should have helped them understand what happened. Instead, the scene raised more questions than it answered, and the mistakes made inside that house in the first hours of the investigation may have permanently destroyed the ability to answer some of them. A crime scene built on contradictions. When investigators entered Nancy's home, they believed they were walking into a scene that would explain everything. At first glance, it looked direct and violent. It looked like a moment that had left clear marks behind. Then they saw the blood. It was not hidden. It was not subtle. There were traces on the front porch, visible enough to stop them in place. Inside the house, more blood appeared, confirmed later through DNA testing to belong to Nancy. That single fact erased any doubt about whether something serious had happened there. This was not a disappearance that could be explained away as confusion or accident. Something had gone terribly wrong inside that house, and it had gone wrong in a physical, undeniable way. And yet, everything else in the house told a different story. Nancy's phone was still there. Her wallet had not been touched. Her keys remained exactly where she would have left them. On the counter, her daily medication sat undisturbed. For a woman who could not walk 50 yards without assistance and who depended on those pills every single day, there was no version of events where she chose to leave that house on her own. She had not walked out. She had been taken. That was the conclusion the scene forced on investigators, and it was the conclusion that the public heard first. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stated openly that he believed Nancy had been abducted. The statement was clear, direct, and confident. Then, just one day later, the sheriff took it back. When reporters asked him why his position had changed, his response stunned the people listening. He told them he was not used to being held accountable for what he said. The man leading the search for an elderly woman who had vanished under violent circumstances admitted in front of the press that accountability was not something he was accustomed to. That moment did not just raise eyebrows, it damaged trust. While the public tried to understand what that meant, the scene itself continued to resist explanation. Investigators searched for a clear point of entry, something that would show how an intruder had entered the property. There were signs that suggested someone had come in from the outside, but nothing formed a clean, logical path. There was no single broken point, and no obvious forced entry that connected neatly to the violence inside. The blood told one story. The signs of intrusion hinted at another. They did not line up. That was when the problems inside the investigation began to surface. A camera mounted on the roof of the property was not checked during the initial examination. It was missed completely. In a case where every second mattered and every angle could hold a clue, a camera that might have captured critical movement was simply overlooked. The doorbell system created another failure. At first, investigators believed its data could not be recovered, so they treated it as a dead end. Only later, through deeper forensic work, was the data pulled back. The evidence had been there the entire time. It had not disappeared. It had only been missed. These were not small mistakes. Each one removed a piece of the timeline that investigators were already struggling to build. Every missed detail made the picture less reliable. Then the failures grew larger. A thermal imaging plane, the kind used to track heat signatures moving away from a location in real time, was not in the air that night. It had not broken down. It had not failed. The pilot had been reassigned. Sources later claimed the reason was personal conflict, something as simple and as damaging as a grudge. That decision meant that if anyone had left Nancy's property carrying her, driving her, or moving her through the surrounding area, there was no aerial system in place to track that movement. Like all these failures weren't enough to raise eyebrows already, the lead sergeant who responded to the scene had no experience handling homicide cases. Detectives with the training and experience needed for a case like this had been sidelined before the investigation even began. The people who should have been there first were not. Then came a decision that could not be undone. The crime scene was released to the public too early. It was opened before every piece of physical evidence had been fully processed and documented. Once that happened, the integrity of the space could no longer be guaranteed. Whatever had been missed before that point became even harder to recover. Criminal profiler Ann Burgess reviewed the details that had been made public. Ann was not an ordinary observer. She had helped build the foundation for how the FBI understands violent offenders. Ann had spent decades studying cases like this. When she looked at the evidence, her conclusion was direct and unsettling. She said something had gone catastrophically wrong inside that house. Ann pointed to the blood and asked the questions no one could answer. Why does it stop? Where does it go? Does it leave in a vehicle? Does it follow a path? Those questions remain open. Because the scene did not come together as a single story. It split in two. One direction suggested something that began from within. It pointed toward familiarity, toward someone who knew the space, someone who could move inside it without immediate resistance. It connected to the calm tone of Nancy's final phone call, to the sense that she had not been in open panic at the start. The other direction pointed outward. It showed signs of deliberate action. Someone had interfered with the security system. Someone had approached or moved around the property. The sequence of events suggested planning, precision, and control. Both directions left evidence behind, but neither one explained everything. And in a case like this, time does not wait. But while investigators were trying to make sense of a scene that refused to align, something else arrived. A series of messages began reaching media outlets. Messages that knew things about the inside of Nancy's home that had never been released to the public. And the level of detail in those messages raised a question far darker than the scene itself. How did whoever wrote these letters know exactly what they knew? The ransom letter that knew too much. before anyone outside law enforcement even thought to ask about it. One of the messages in the collection, referred to by investigators as the ransom messages, described the exact location of Nancy's Apple Watch inside her home. The message did not just mention that Nancy owned one. It pointed to its location, and this place was not obvious. It was a place no one would casually guess. That single line changed how every message that followed would be treated, because that kind of knowledge does not come from a distance. These ransom messages did not begin the way anyone expected. There was no direct call to the family, no immediate contact with negotiators. Instead, the messages arrived through email, and they did not go to the people closest to Nancy. They went to the media. The first major note reached KOLD News, 13 in Tucson, on the evening of February 2nd, just one day after Nancy was reported missing. It was written in the clear, controlled language. It demanded $4 million in Bitcoin to be paid to a specific wallet address by February 5th. It warned that if the deadline passed, the demand would increase to $6 million by February 9th. The numbers were large, but the investigators did not focus on them for long. They were focused on what the message knew. The Apple Watch detail was not the only one. The note also mentioned a floodlight at the rear of the property, describing it as broken. That detail had never been released to the public. It had not even been discussed in any press briefing. Later, aerial footage confirmed it. 2 floodlights were hanging loose at the back of the house, damaged and clearly visible once someone knew where to look. The message had described the scene with accuracy. FBI Special Agent in Charge Hythe Janke confirmed that those details immediately drew attention. He stated that one message talked about an Apple Watch and another mentioned a floodlight. Those were not random observations. They were specific physical elements of the property. That meant only one thing. Whoever wrote those messages had either been inside Nancy's home or had direct access to someone who had. TMZ founder Harvey Levin examined the note and spoke about it publicly. He pointed out that the grammar was precise and structured, not rushed or careless. Levin also emphasized the importance of the Apple Watch detail, explaining that its location inside the home was something that would immediately interest federal investigators. He added that a phrase in the message suggested Nancy might still be somewhere within the Tucson area, though that detail was far from confirmed. Law enforcement sources shared a similar concern. The content of the message did not feel like guesswork. It felt observed. Then a retired FBI agent reviewed the language and found something subtle but important. The writer referred to money using the term USD. That is not how most Americans naturally describe dollars in everyday writing. It is more common in international or formal contexts. The agent suggested this detail could point to someone outside the country, or to someone intentionally shaping their language to hide where they were from. Then a second message arrived with a different tone and structure. The writer referenced how the case was being reported in the news and responded to details published only hours earlier. This was no longer a static threat. This was someone watching, reading every update, tracking every report, and adjusting their words in real time. Then a third message reached TMZ. Those who read it described it as more graphic and more disturbing than anything that had come before. The demand shifted again, now asking for approximately $6 million in a different cryptocurrency. The language was harsher, the warnings more explicit. It was no longer just about money. It was about control and fear. 2 separate individuals then came forward, each claiming independent knowledge of Nancy's location. One said they had seen her south of the border and demanded $70,000 in Bitcoin for details. The other claimed to have witnessed the kidnapping itself and demanded $50,000 to identify the person responsible. Both claims added noise, but no clarity. Then authorities arrested Derek Colella, a 42-year-old from California, who had been sending fraudulent ransom messages directly to Nancy's daughter Annie, trying to profit from the disappearance of an elderly woman. His arrest confirmed what investigators had begun to fear. Not every message was real. The case was now flooded with competing voices, each pulling attention in a different direction at the exact moment investigators needed focus. But the original note remained different. The Apple Watch detail could not be ignored. The floodlight detail could not be dismissed. They were observations tied directly to the physical space of Nancy's home. Someone with access to that house had written that message. The threat was not distant. It was connected. And while investigators struggled to distinguish genuine communications from fabricated ones, the forensic analysis was spiraling into its own crisis. Evidence pulled from the scene was yielding results that only deepened the mystery. And at the heart of this confusion was a DNA issue that no laboratory had been able to fully resolve. The DNA problem nobody can solve. A few weeks into the investigation, investigators discovered a glove roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home, lying in a place that immediately drew attention. Once investigators connected it to the footage, the FBI had already released surveillance video showing a masked figure outside Nancy's front door. The person in that footage was not vague or unclear. He was armed. He wore a balaclava that hid his face. He carried a backpack. A gun holster sat between his legs in a strange position that stood out to anyone who studied it closely. The glove appeared to match what that person was wearing. It seemed like the perfect break investigators had been waiting for. That single detail shifted the energy of the entire investigation. For the first time, there was something physical that seemed to connect directly to the suspect seen at Nancy's home. Investigators moved quickly. The glove was collected and sent for DNA analysis without delay. This was not just another item found in the search area. This was potentially the first real link to the person who had been at her door. The anticipation was not limited to local investigators. Experts across the country were watching closely. C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, followed the development in real time. Her work had helped identify some of the most elusive suspects in modern cases, including the Golden State Killer and Brian Kohberger in the University of Idaho murders. When she confirmed that a DNA profile had been recovered from the glove and submitted to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal Database, it felt like the case had reached a turning point. Then the results came back, but instead of answers, they brought even more questions. There was no match in CODIS. The person whose DNA was on that glove had no prior record in the system. That did not end the lead, but it made it harder. It meant the identity would not come easily. Still, the glove remained the strongest physical connection investigators had. Everything leaned toward it. Then the second result arrived from a laboratory in Florida, and the entire lead collapsed. The glove did not belong to the suspect. It belonged to a restaurant worker employed at a business across the street from where it had been found. That person had absolutely nothing to do with the case. The glove had been discarded during a routine work shift. It had only ended up in the search area by chance. To understand how damaging that was, you have to look at the full picture. Investigators had collected around 16 gloves from the area surrounding Nancy's home. Most of them came from volunteers who had been searching and had thrown them away after use. Out of all those items, the one glove that visually matched the suspect in the footage turned out to be nothing more than trash left behind after a lunch shift. The most promising lead in the entire case was gone, just like that. With the glove eliminated, attention shifted back to the one place that still held answers: the inside of Nancy's house. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed that DNA had been recovered from within the residence. But it was not simple, it was mixed. That means the sample contained genetic material from more than one person, all blended together in a way that made analysis difficult. He described it as a challenge, explaining that the lab was struggling to separate the profiles cleanly. He warned that it could take months, possibly longer, before the DNA reached a stage where advanced identification methods could even be applied. But the situation was far more serious than that. Forensic experts who reviewed the case began to believe the mixture was not just from 2 people. It likely contained DNA from 3 or more individuals. C.C. Moore addressed this directly when she said, "I would assume it would be Nancy plus 2 or more unknowns." And at least one of those unknown contributors was male. That changes everything. It suggests that more than one unidentified person may have been inside Nancy's home that fateful night. This was not a single intruder or a simple one-on-one encounter. Instead, it may have involved 2 separate individuals who were both unaccounted for and who both left traces behind. The mixture in the home remained too complex to separate into clear profiles that could be run through databases. The evidence existed, but it could not yet be used the way investigators needed. Then another failure surfaced, and this one was harder to explain. The Pima County Sheriff's Department had not sent the DNA evidence to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. That facility has advanced technology designed specifically for analyzing complex DNA mixtures like this one. Instead, The evidence was sent to a private lab in Florida. That puzzling decision delayed everything. The FBI's Assistant Director for Public Affairs, Ben Williamson, later addressed it publicly. He wrote, "The FBI asked to test this DNA 2 months ago with the same technology we've always had when the local sheriff instead sent it to a private lab." 11 weeks passed before the Florida lab transferred the original hair sample to the FBI for testing. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer responded with clear frustration. She said, "Knowing that they had that technology, that should really have the Guthrie family and anybody who cares about justice for Nancy Guthrie upset, because that is not tracking at all. The delay could not be reversed. The time had already been lost. And yet, even with all of that, the DNA inside that house still held power." Cece Moore made that clear in the most direct way possible. She did not focus on the delays. She focused instead on what the evidence still meant. She said, "I am so happy to hear that the sheriff confirmed that they did find an unknown person's DNA at the crime scene. That is fantastic." Then she added the sentence that now hangs over the entire case. "If I was the kidnapper, I would be extremely concerned right now, because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified." That statement is not speculation. It is based on a method that has already exposed suspects who believed they would never be found. It is the same approach that brought names to cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Now it is pointed directly at whatever happened inside Nancy's home. The DNA is still being processed, Nancy is still missing, but everything that has been uncovered so far points to 2 unknown individuals inside that house, forcing a question that has no clean answer yet, but one that all the evidence taken together forces investigators to ask. 2 sequences, 1 night, no answers. It has now been more than 80 days since Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive. No suspect has been named, no arrest has been made, no confirmed proof of life has ever arrived. Her condition remains unknown, and so does her location. Inside that silence, the most public face connected to the case stepped away from everything. Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of the most watched morning program in America, and the daughter who had sat at the dinner table with her mother just hours before she disappeared, suspended her broadcasting duties entirely. That included stepping away from her role in covering major national events, including co-hosting responsibilities for the opening ceremonies of the 2026 Winter Olympics. Savannah left the anchor desk to search for her mother. When she finally spoke publicly, she chose a conversation with Hoda Kolb. The tone was controlled at first, and careful in the way people speak when they are trying to hold themselves together. Then the words broke through that control. "It's too much to bear to think that I brought this to her bedside, that it's because of me," Savannah said. "I'm so sorry, Mommy. I'm so sorry." There was no recovery from that moment in the interview. The weight of it filled every pause that followed. Savannah has come to believe her mother was not chosen at random. She believes Nancy was targeted because of her. That belief has not been proven, but it has not gone away either. The Guthrie family has offered $1 million for information leading to Nancy's safe recovery. With additional contributions from federal authorities, the total reward now exceeds $1.2 million, but the money has changed nothing about the outcome so far. At the same time, the system responsible for finding her has been pulling itself apart under pressure. Sheriff Chris Nanos is now facing a formal recall effort. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to question his leadership and handling of the case itself. An independent investigation into a workplace harassment complaint has also resurfaced concerns about internal dysfunction within his office, including allegations raised by a former lieutenant who had competed against him in the 2024 election. And while all these are happening, life outside the investigation keeps moving in strange proximity to it. Savannah has returned to the anchor desk, reading news stories she cannot fully separate herself from. Behind the scenes, producers have prepared a code word protocol. If new developments arrive during a live broadcast, she will be quietly removed from the set before she is told. It is a system designed to protect her from collapse in real time. 80 days have passed. $1 million has been offered. 2 unknown DNA profiles remain inside a laboratory system, still trying to separate them. A phone call made in the middle of a quiet evening still sits at the center of everything. With footsteps in the background, and no clear explanation for what came next. And somewhere inside that FBI lab, the only piece of evidence that moves toward a conclusion is still waiting for a name.